Well, boils and ghouls, it's your old pal, John Kassir, the voice of the Crypt Keeper. And I want to welcome my good fiends of the Horror Heals podcast. Is horror good for mental wellness? But of course it is. I delight in the delicious deaths of pitiful people on the silver screen. So get ready for a hell of a good time with my new fiends, Corey and Kendall, on the Horror Heals podcast.
Hey, horror family. Welcome to a special bonus episode of Horror Heals. We've talked a lot about how horror helps us process trauma, connect with our emotions, and even find community in unexpected places. Well, today's guest, Brad Ewell, has a story that takes those themes to a whole new level. Brad's journey started with a DNA surprise, discovering a biological father he never knew existed. But when that reunion led him to a maximum security prison in Louisiana, what he expected to be a one-time meeting turned into something far more complex. Through it all, Brad has leaned on his love of horror and his passion for creating art, something that took on even more meaning when he faced a life-changing surgery. This story is about identity, resilience, and the healing power of creativity, even when life throws a few unexpected twists your way. Let's get into it. Brad, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to see y'all and talk to you.
Yeah, us too. We love the idea of being able to do a crossover episode of both of our podcasts. Let me set the scene for listeners. Kind of fortuitous that I attended the Untangling Our Roots Summit last March, and Brad had already been a guest on the Family Twist podcast, but on the morning that we were wrapping up, Sunday morning, I was like in the lobby with people like crying and stuff till like 2 a.m. until finally my voice was gone. And so I had to go, and I woke up, not feeling fantastic. So I kind of like, rather than being in one of my flashy suits, I just went like, sort of incognito down to the lobby to get my stuff. But I was wearing an Exorcist t-shirt, and Brad spotted that. And then we immediately started talking about his artwork. So maybe we could just jump in right there. Like, where did your passion for horror-themed artwork come from?
So there was such a long lag for me in not having a passion for art and just doing everything I could to ignore it. And then really what happened for me was in 2023, I blew my knee up at work one day and had surgery that left me in a locked out leg brace for about 4 months. Wow. And so we have a 2-story house. I made it upstairs once, and that's where I stayed for 4 months. Wow. And my wife grabbed me. She remembered back when I was in high school, I used to love lino cut printing, where you carve into a linoleum block and then print it. And she realized I was going to pretty quickly get bored sitting up in our bedroom all day. And she brought that. And my immediate thought was, oh, I'm sitting up here watching scary movies. What horror movie art could I do sitting here watching movies? And that's really how it started.
Awesome. Well, listeners, Brad sent us some beautiful pieces of art that we received a couple of days ago. And we just been looking at them and just reflecting on them. I really love the concept of creating a piece of horror art on a page of the book that's, the horror story takes place in. So you sent us a really cool Hannibal Lecter from Silence of the Lambs. So where did you get that idea, like, to start producing artwork on actual book pages?
It was something that I had simply never seen before. I've seen lots of printmaking, and I think everybody that is an artist and wants to do art wants to do something just a little bit different. And I started looking for, okay, so I'm going to make this print. What could I do to make it different than anybody else's Hannibal Lecter print? And I suddenly started thinking, I'm one of those people that if Corey, you and I've already had this experience where you tell me there's a movie, but then I find out there's a book of that movie. I have to go read that book.
Yeah.
So for me, every horror movie that had started as a book, I've read that before I've seen it. And that just seemed like the perfect way to tie both of those pieces of art together. Because there's a lot of people, I mean, books like The Exorcist and Jaws, people know that those were books before they were movies.
Right.
You go to the movie that you pushed me towards, Found, a lot of people aren't going to know that that was a book ever.
Right. True. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and there's this sort of, back in the 80s, it was pretty common for there to be like novelizations of movies, like after the movie came out or when the movie came out. And that's starting to become like a thing again. I've noticed with like some of these indie movies, they're doing novelizations of Pearl and X. And then there was just in time for the 50th anniversary, a Black Christmas novelization, limited edition that came out that Lynn Griffin did the introduction for. So it's kind of cool to see it kind of like coming back, that the whole idea of the retro novelization coming back into this way.
Well, and I think we're all close to the same age. So for me, it's changed so much because before the movie was always going to be a little less than the book because you couldn't fit a book into 2-ish hours of a movie. Mm-hmm. And now that Amazon and Netflix and everybody are doing 8-part series, you actually get to see an entire book made into a movie finally.
Mm-hmm. Good point. It's true. So interesting. I didn't know about the aspect of you having to have surgery. So like, we talk about horror can be healing in so many different ways. And literally like you were healing while you were creating horror or watching horror.
Yes. Yep. My knee was slowly putting itself back together.
So did you have horror movies have been like a lifelong thing for you?
I have liked them as long as I can remember. My fascination started back with the early Friday the 13th. Some people will argue whether it's a horror movie or not. My first horror movie memories are Jaws, and seeing that, I guess I would have been about 5.5 with parents that loved Southern California beach vacations. And that really jacked up vacations for me for a while because going out in the ocean didn't seem that cool.
And we were back to the lake.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about that this morning, about like Jaws. Is Jaws a horror movie? I'm thinking, yeah. And then immediately I'm thinking of the scene where like the head, comes out underwater. It's like, yeah, it's a horror movie. I don't care that the whole thing takes place in the daylight on the beach. It's definitely a horror movie.
Yeah.
So awesome. So let's talk a little bit about the flip side of your story. I know you've shared it on the Family Twist podcast, but I believe you were around age 42 when you and your wife decided to gift each other DNA kits.
Yep, I've been working on writing this story, and I just found we did Ancestry. I found the email receipt for it in 2015. I'd have been 44, I guess. 45. I think it was 45 by the time we did the kits.
Yeah. So you were going in there sort of expecting to find out like, where am I from? But you literally found out where you were from.
Yes. So, I mean, we did it as a pure for fun thing. It didn't turn out to be as fun as it sounded at first, but like the dad that raised me was an airline pilot and an international pilot. So I had always asked when he'd go overseas, I'm like, hey, get our family crest and stuff like that. I'm curious where we came from. And the answer I always got was, nobody cares about that. And I eventually learned that, okay, apparently that's not something you ask about. So I blew it off. And then, you fast forward decades and all of a sudden you can spit in a tube and send it off to this company and find out where you came from. Well, I couldn't get my dad to bring stuff back. So that seemed like the easiest way to find out. So, I mean, we did that in 2015. And when we did it, I'm still shocked to this day that my raising parents that hadn't told me I was adopted came over to the house. My wife's parents came over. We Chromecast all that on the TV, showed them the results, and everybody sat there like, wow, that's really neat. And nobody said a word about what could come from this later. The discovery was actually in 2019. So I floated for 4 years still with no clue that anything was coming.
You hadn't really been messing around with the relative side of things.
No, I mean, my paradigm was so locked into where I came from that it never even occurred to me to look. I mean, why would I go look at people I already know are going to be on a list? The
Right,
only thing
right.
I really wanted to see was A, I wanted to know if I was Irish, and B, if I wasn't, where I came from in the world. And once I saw that map, I was kind of like, okay, cool. So I'm English, kind of Irish and Scottish, a little bit Norwegian, done.
Yeah. Whereas for me, it would have been the complete opposite because I was, going in there hoping, well, A, to find out the ethnic stuff, but also to see people. And of course, I didn't recognize any of the names, which makes
Right.
perfectly good sense.
Well, I mean, had I looked at my matches, I would have realized I don't know
Right.
who any of these people are, but I
Right.
didn't care to look because that was
Right.
not a curiosity.
Yep.
So, what got you to the revelation that you were indeed adopted?
So in 2019, about 4 years after we took the test, a woman reached out to us through, I didn't realize Ancestry had like its own little email messenger. And my wife had stayed on there because she was playing around building our family trees and doing genealogy. And she got this message that just said, I'm trying to figure out how I'm related to this BE person on your account. So she asked me and showed me the lady's name. And I mean, looking back now, I feel so stupid saying this, but it never occurred to me to go to the matches and see who this person was. I was like, well, I don't know who she is. And my wife's like, well, what do you think? I was like, you're welcome to talk to her, but I don't have a clue who she is. And I grew up the child of an only child. I was an only child myself. And then my mom was an only child. And my dad had one brother and they didn't really talk much. So we were kind of a really insulated small family. So having somebody pop out of the woodwork that might be an aunt wasn't weird. So Pam told me, she said, well, do you care if I talk to her and we try to figure out how she's related to you? I don't care at all. I'm not really curious or that interested, but sure. So they carried on for the better part of probably 2 or 3 weeks of just talking back and forth, trying to figure out how I was related to her. A backside of this story that I've still never fully looked into yet was I learned probably 5, 6 years before my adoption discovery that the mom that raised me also may have been a late discovery adoptee. Still am not sure to this day. Her mother told her she was adopted pretty close to when her mom died, and my mom did not want to look into it at all, and she's since passed. So we really don't know. At some point, I'll try to dig into it, but now we're talking about adoption records from back in the 40s. So it's a little more legwork. I mean, from 70 was bad enough. From the 40s, I don't know what there is. But this lady was, I think, 2 or 3 years younger than my mom. And I was like, could be easily a cousin, a half sibling if she's adopted. And that's how we've matched here. So that was the assumption my wife was working off of. And they talked back and forth for quite a while. My wife gave her all the information she could think of to let this woman go into Ancestry and see if she could figure that out. And after about 3 weeks, my wife and I were out on a lunch date, and she gets a text and she looks at her phone, and we've been together at this point for, let's see, 2019 would be 27 years. So she gets a text and she makes a face that I immediately know isn't a good face. It's, something's off. And I'm like, so what's that? And she said, well, that lady that I've been talking to through Ancestry just texted me. And I'm not sure how you're going to feel about this. And I was like, well, we can't leave that can of worms closed up now that we've just cracked it open like that. So what did she say? And she said, well, she said that her sister had a baby boy in Dallas on your birthday, and she believes it's you and your parents never told you you're adopted. And I sat with that for a second, and then really we both laughed it off because it made no sense in my world that was a possibility. So we laughed it off, and I told my wife, I was like, I've gone from being ambivalent about this to kind of feeling bad because this lady is way off on the wrong track. So ask her what hospital she thinks I was born in. I'll go home that night, get my birth certificate out, and we can compare notes. And if nothing else, I can get her back on the right track. So that was where that conversation ended for that time. And then it turned out I was way more wrong than she was.
Well, I mean, just the birth date alone, is shocking,
It was. And at the same time, and I think some of it is psychologically, you try to protect yourself. But in my brain, my immediate thought was, how many baby boys were born in Dallas on my birthday? At least probably 15, 20, 30.
Right.
So what are the odds? And, I'm asking the hospital because maybe that's in one hospital. If you do the whole Metroplex, how many baby boys were born here that day?
At what point did you think, like, well, maybe I should have a conversation with my parents about this?
I avoided that like the plague. It was literally the last thing I wanted to do. So that night I came home and pulled out my birth certificate. I'd used it to apply for jobs and things for 30-ish years by then. I'd never really looked at it. So I pulled it out and I immediately go, okay, there's a box for the actual address or hospital that you were born in. And I'm like, I'm going to start there because that's what I've asked this lady to tell me. And mine had a dash in it. There's no location. And I was like, well, that's kind of weird. So then I start going over my birth certificate and noticing, there's things that I would think would be on there. Like there's a place where the father signs as the witness to the birth, or somebody signs as the witness to the birth. Mine had my dad's name typed in. And I was like, well, that doesn't make sense because you should have to sign that as the witness. So then I pulled my wife's birth certificate out because she was born in 1970 in Dallas as well, and put the two side by side. And that's when the wheels really started to come off the bus because neither one of them, they looked like they were two completely separate documents. Mine looks like an old microfiche copy. Hers looks like a legitimate legal document that someone typed up and signed. But even after that, I looked at it and thought to myself, well, I mean, okay, yeah, it's different. It's weird. But that's probably what a 1970s copy of a birth certificate looked like. And I bet my parents lost mine at some point. Easy peasy, makes sense. It sticks with my little paradigm, and I'm much happier with the way things are than having this big change. So that's an easy acceptance. But at the same time, I was sitting there racking my brain trying to think of, has my mom ever told my parents lived close to us our whole lives. They were there for all three of our kids' births. And I'm like, did my mom ever talk about when I was born? And the more I racked my brain, the more I realized, no, there was never a story. There was never, I think it's a standard mom guilt trip of, I was in labor with you for this many hours and this is how you treat me. I had never heard it. So then my parents were also big on taking pictures. So I start racking my brain like, a pregnant picture of my mom. Surely I've seen a pregnant picture of my mom. And once again, no, I can't think of one. So then when we got back home, Pam's parents, my wife's parents were at our house. So I was in one room messing with all these ideas, and Pam was in the room with her parents actually talking genealogy and stuff like that. So I just kind of stuck my head around the corner and said, hey, did that lady ever tell you that place that we were asking her about? And she grabbed her phone and she said, well, she doesn't have the address, but she remembers it was this little women's clinic on a street called Turner Avenue in Dallas. And it was a white building with green awnings. Well, I can't tell you what my face looked like, but I can tell you my heart just sunk because I knew exactly where she was talking about. I had been there over and over again as a kid. It was 2-ish miles from my grandparents' house. And there was this nice doctor, Dr. Carmichael, who was a family friend that every time we would go see my grandma and grandpa, we would stop in and see Dr. Carmichael on the way. And, I never thought anything of it. It just adults were seeing each other and I'm the kid tagging along and you go hang out and leave. So as soon as she mentioned the place, I Googled it, made sure that I wasn't crazy. And sure enough, here's this white brick building with green awnings and the big old 70s glass mosaic brick tiles that go in the wall that you can't really see through but let light in. Yep. And I'm sitting there like, oh no, I've been to this place a lot. And that's more of a coincidence than I really liked. But still, the last thing, I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but I can speak for myself when I finally had to do it. But the last thing I want to do is call my mom and dad and be like, hey, did y'all adopt me and not tell me? That's a weird conversation to have in general. We got the idea. Actually, my wife had the idea. We had a good friend from church at the time that had known she was adopted her whole life. Right after 9/11, decided life was too short. She wanted to find her biological family. Went through the whole headache of unsealing birth records, was able to decipher a signature on a piece of non-identifying information, actually found her birth mom, then found her birth dad, and had reconnected with her bio family. So we thought that would be an easy way, somebody great to talk to that could maybe point me in a direction that I could at least have something tangible to go off of before I made this phone call. Because, I mean, ultimately, if my parents had kept this a secret for coming up on, at this point, 50 years, and I said, hey, am I adopted? And they said, no. Well, there's this other person out here in the world saying I'm adopted with all this really weird stuff going on. So it wouldn't get me anywhere. So I wanted to have something more concrete than just an answer at this point. So I call, it's now the next day, I call our friend from church and I'm telling her my story. She said, well, hey, do you have a copy of your birth certificate? I said, I do. And she said, well, send it to me. I'm going to hang up. I'm going to go find mine and I'll call you back. Well, we had known each other for probably a decade by then. And when she called me back, her name's Jan, I got a different Jan on the phone. We had a very fun, hey, how's everybody doing? Blah, 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 conversation. And when she called me back, it was, hey. And I'm like, oh, I don't like how that sounds. Hey, it's kind of like when the doctor comes in to tell you bad news, start. And she's like, I'm going to send you a copy of my birth certificate to look at. And I said, okay, no problem. So my phone dings, I look at it. And my first thought is, oh, she actually accidentally sent me my birth certificate back. So I blow it up and I realize, no, it's hers. And she was born, I think, in 1968 in Texas. And her birth certificate and mine are the exact same. Same black microfiche copy, same missing information, same type things where there should be signatures. And I'm like, oh, no. And she said, I don't really know an easy way to tell you this, but I looked it up before I called you back. And this is what adoption birth certificates in Texas looked like in the 1970s. So more than likely, this lady's right, you're adopted. But still, how can I find out without asking my parents? Because I still don't want to. Yeah. It still sounds like a horrible idea to make this phone call. And she walked me through what she had done. And at the end, basically told me, you can do all the gist of it was you can present all the evidence you want to the court that granted your adoption. And at the end of the day, the judge will say, sure, I'll let you see your records, or no, I won't. And there's no recourse afterwards. There's no appeal process. It's just they let you see it or they don't. And she's like, so A, that's going to take you a few months. And B, you're just rolling dice. It's just if they decide they want to, they do. So your real best bet is to ask your parents. And I'm like, oh, that's, once again, the whole reason we're on the phone is that's not what I want to do today. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what pushed me to the actual conversation.
It's a difficult conversation to approach. Like, how do you even start something like that?
Well, so I mean, for a living for quite a while, I've had difficult conversations with people. So I'm like, I'll come up with this awesome plan. And so just backstory for me and my raising family. I was very close with my dad. My mom and I struggled in our relationship for our whole lives. Just a sad fact. So my immediate thought was, well, it's not weird for me to get a hold of my dad. My mom and dad were married until they both passed. But it was not out of place for me to call my dad and be like, hey, I want to talk to you. I've got a couple things I'm trying to figure out, and it would be easier if it was just you and I. That wasn't a weird thing to have to do. So I was like, that's what I'll do. And dad would have been, I guess, 70, 79 at this time. So he had a cell phone, but like most older folks, that cell phone stayed turned off in a drawer in the house unless he went somewhere. So I built up this grand plan in my head of I'm at work when all this is going on. And I'm like, I'm going to call him about 6, 7 at night. He'll be at home. The phone will be turned off in a drawer. And I'm just going to leave a message. Hey, we haven't seen each other in a little while. I'm like, we hadn't seen each other and caught up. Let's meet up and have coffee, have a beer, have lunch, whatever is fine. By the way, there's a couple things I'm trying to figure out. Nothing bad is happening. But if you and I could just meet for lunch, that would be great. So that was my grand plan. I'm going to call, leave this message on his cell phone, and it's going to be perfect. And the plan was perfect right till he answered the phone. And I'm like, shit, no, you're not supposed to answer the phone. This is supposed to be a message. So I quickly gather my thoughts up again. I'm like, okay, I can still do this live. It's the same thing. It's just with a person instead of leaving a message now. So I start off, hey, we haven't seen each other in a while. I thought it'd be fun to catch up. I'm like, nobody's broke. Nobody's sick. The kids are great. Nobody's getting divorced. Everybody's fine. Nothing is wrong. But it'd be fun to see you. And I am trying to do a couple things with work and things like that. It'd just be good if you and I could catch up and I could bounce some ideas off of you. And this is a conversation I would say we've had hundreds of times. And the answer had always been, sure, here's a day I'm free. Does that work for you? And for once, he says, sure. Why? What do you want to talk about? And I was like, well, like I said, nobody's sick, nobody's broke, nobody needs money, and blah, 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 my whole list again. Just pick a time, Dad, and we'll meet. And he's like, yeah, sure. I definitely want to pick a time, but I want to know what we're going to talk about. And I feel like, we've all had a situation where time slows down. I felt like we circled that drain for an hour. It was probably a minute of me explaining how we didn't need to do this right now and him coming back to, yeah, but why? So finally I got to a point and I was like, okay, there's nothing else I can do here. So I said, Dad, you understand I'm trying not to have a phone conversation with you? And he goes, yeah, oh yeah, I understand. I just want to know what we're going to talk about and then I'll meet you. And I was like, okay, so well, here we go. So he was the one that had told me that my mom had found out that she was possibly adopted. My mom had never told me, and I come from obviously a solid family of secret keepers. So I was told never to tell my mom that I knew that she was possibly adopted. So he and I had this conversation she and I never had. So that's what I started with. Well, do you remember how you told me that Mom was adopted? Oh, yeah, sure. I remember that. I said, and you remember we did this ancestry test? Oh, yeah. I said, well, this woman reached out to us through Ancestry. And I was picking my words so carefully, trying to at some point have him just catch a glimpse of what might be coming to shut this down. Because even as much as I wanted to know, I didn't want to do this on the phone, especially not sitting at work on the phone, because, that's not the place to do anything like this. So I'm like, well, so this woman reached out to us and we thought, I put a big, hard emphasis on, that it could be Mom's cousin, half-sister, something like that. And he went, well, that's fascinating. I didn't realize they could do stuff like that. I was like, yeah, apparently they can. And I pause again, thinking, in a minute, his brain is going to catch up to where we are and realize, oh, I don't want to do this anymore right now. It doesn't work. So I sigh again. I'm like, but it turns out that's not what she thinks. And he's like, oh, what is it? I said, well, she said that her sister had a baby boy in Dallas on my birthday, and she thinks it's me, and she believes y'all adopted me and never told me. And so I haven't said it on the show yet on this one. So at this point, I'd been a cop for 24 years. And most of my life has been asking questions and expecting certain responses. So I had a laundry list of things that would have been good responses from my dad. Like, that woman is crazy. She's out to try to get money from you. Avoid her. I was waiting for any of those. And what I got was, and not another word. And I was like, oh no. For me, that at that moment right there, I was like, well, no, she's right.
Yeah.
And so what I learned later was I could hear my dad's fingers drumming. It turned out I managed to call at the time that he took a 10-minute run to the store, or all of my plan would have worked out perfect. But so he's sitting in the car by himself, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. And I'm sitting there waiting for something to happen. And finally I said, Dad, I don't want to be a dick. And I know this is hard, but you're going to have to say it out loud. I already know the answer. There's no more surprise here. But until you say it, I'm going to question if I'm reading this right, even though I'm 100% sure I am. And he drummed for another few seconds and went, well, Bradley, you're adopted and we've been trying to figure out how to tell you. It was just a lie to compound the other lies. I mean, I was 49 years old. I had had cancer in my 30s. My wife and I had struggled through infertility and IVF when we were trying to have kids. I can look back and see a litany of times where wouldn't have been a fun time to tell me that I'm adopted in the middle of us going through infertility, but it would have opened up the opportunity to be like, we had this same problem and here's what we did. And we probably should have told you before. I even remember one of the things that has stuck in my head was I had thyroid cancer I think I was 38. And I was laying in the pre-op room, all in my little gown with my hairnet on, and my mom and my dad are there, and my kid, I guess I would have had 2 kids back then. My 2 kids and my wife were there. And my mom, out of the blue, goes, this is just so strange. Cancer doesn't run in our family.
Okay.
And so, once again, one of those times to say, but maybe we need to talk about your medical history. But no. My personal belief, and I'll never know, they're both passed now, and it was nothing they would ever admit to. They were taking that to their grave. I was never going to learn that from them.
What's funny, another guest on Family Twist said to me recently, Corey wasn't able to be on that episode, but he urged us to do a Family Twist episode about shame. And I think it's so sad that your mom felt shame about her own situation and obviously felt it about yours as well, and it was a different time. I totally get
100%.
that. Totally get that. But my hometown was so small. My parents used to joke and say, we couldn't have kept it from you, even if we wanted to. They didn't want to, but like everybody knew I was adopted. So, it wasn't like they acquired me and then moved to that town. They were in that town, so that baby just showed up,
Well, yeah. And see, I think that's one of the things that helped my parents dodge that bullet was when my parents adopted me, they were living, and this turns into this whole not long, but a gray market adoption story of they were living in Chicago. He was flying for American Airlines. My mom wanted to come back to Dallas because that's where her mom and dad were. So the plan all along had been for them to return to Dallas and be based in Dallas. But they were living in Chicago. My bio mom, by, all the magic of serendipity in the world, shows up at Dr. Carmichael's clinic, a family friend of my parents, who my parents had told, we can't have kids and we might consider adopting one. So my bio mom shows up pregnant with a kid that she wants to give up, tells Dr. Carmichael, I want to give up this kid. Dr. Carmichael calls my parents in Chicago and says, hey, did y'all want to adopt a baby? Because if you do, I think I have one. And that's how all that transpired. But when they adopted me, they were in Chicago. Now, that wasn't technically legal back then. They actually had a fake nursery in my grandparents' house in Dallas that whenever they came to do the check-ins on me that they had to do, they would fly back and put me in this nursery and claim they lived there. But then after 7 or 8 months of having me, they moved back to Dallas, and it was a pilot, a flight attendant, and a new baby showing up in town. Nobody asked where I came from. That was just assumed. Yep. So there wasn't any work to keep the secret. I say that the part that surprises me is I didn't find out till probably 2-ish years after I found out I was adopted. Literally everybody else, grandparents, aunts, uncles, all of those people knew I was adopted, and nobody slipped for 49 years, which is impressive to me.
It is. I mean, it's hard. I don't want to judge people, but it's like, the secrecy and that's hard to justify. But, and I find myself, and I don't know how you feel about your adoptive grandparents, but in my situation, I'm disgusted with both sets of my biological grandparents for never, like admitting it, saying, I wish they had slipped up. You know what I mean? Like I wish,
Yeah.
because they kept it so secret. I was such a dirty little secret, and that makes me angry often.
Oh, absolutely.
They're all gone. There's nobody to be angry at. So it's really futile, but it's still real.
My uncle, my adoptive dad's brother's first wife, because she'd always been nice and we'd kind of kept in touch even after they divorced. And I reached out to her one day and said, I've got a really weird question for you. Did y'all know that I was adopted? And her first response was, oh my God, they never told you? And I was like, no, not. She had assumed that somebody had told me at some point. Now, by then, all the adoptive grandparents had long passed, but the ones that were closer in age to my parents had all assumed that, oh, he must know by now. So she was as surprised as I was to know that I didn't know. But you're right. It does lead to, there's some legitimate anger behind secrets there.
Right. And I wonder, I'm sure you've thought about this, Brad, that how different would your relationship be with your adoptive mother if that secret wasn't there and her secret about maybe being adopted wasn't there?
That is one of those things that will haunt me probably for the rest of my life, because I think that we could have had a much better relationship. My mom had some serious issues that she needed help with that she never got help with. But to this day, I feel like I could have understood her better had I understood that she couldn't have a kid of her own. Mm-hmm. I feel ultimately there are some very narrow, different situations. But like for my parents, I don't believe they wanted to adopt a child. They wanted to have a biological child and they couldn't. So at the best, I'm a consolation prize to that. Mm-hmm. And it's not a pity party for me. And then you add into that, she was a very insecure person. Mm-hmm. And I look at pictures of like newly adopted babies and I think of my own 3 kids. Even though I was biologically their father, there were times that nobody in the world could calm them down but my wife. There came a point where all the rocking, all the singing, all the things I could do didn't fix it. And the minute they got in their mom's arm, they were dead asleep. Well, what happens in that same scenario when you're a person that's insecure and desperately needs approval, and that baby is not going to calm down for you because you are not who that baby is looking for? That just compounds that pain that you're already dealing with. It was a different time, but people needed therapy back then too, and nobody went. So then you get the one thing in the world you want, and that thing kind of rejects you. And through no fault of anybody, it's just biology. I was looking for the place that I had known for 9 months, and there was this person that wouldn't let me go. I still remember when my kids were little, if you didn't eventually give them to your mom, it went from I'm upset and crying to I am furious until I get where I want to go.
Yeah. You made me think of something that now my adoptive mother seemed very in touch with her emotions. But I remember as I got older and after she had passed away, my adoptive dad would tell me that she had some strange feelings about the fact that she couldn't breastfeed me it was compounded by the fact that it took months for them to find a suitable formula. In fact, my weight kept fluctuating and I got below weight and, that sort of thing. And which made them both feel guilty. Like, we're not giving this child what he needs, but they were doing the very best they could. But my mother had, I think, real guilt associated with being unable to, quote, provide, nourishment to me as a baby. And I'll never know how that feels, but
no,
I can only imagine how, because to your point, my parents had tried and it had 3 miscarriages, before they ever decided to adopt. That was apparently torturous for my for for both of them, I'm sure, but my mother was really
Well,
affected by that.
my wife had 3 miscarriages before we had our first kid, or our
Yep.
2 before our first kid, and then 1 after our first kiddo. So I mean, it's brutal on everybody. My adoptive parents were the opposite. Dad had mumps when he was a kid and made him infertile.
Yep.
So it was just a no-go from the beginning.
Did your mother know that? So, I mean, she was going into a relationship?
I don't know if either of them knew until they tried. I don't know if that was, we were trying and it's not working, what's happening? And then they go, oh, well, he had the mumps and he's infertile now.
Mhm.
But, what I think Corey said, and I think Kendall, you said it too, there's that shame element there. Before my dad was an airline pilot, he was a Navy fighter pilot. He was a football star. So back in those days, well, that you don't want to admit that you can't have babies. You're this manly man. Of course you can have babies.
Right.
So I think there was really shame and pain for both of them that they never worked through.
Absolutely. I mean, my dad would say to me too, like, I felt successful in so many ways in my life, but I wasn't able to help my wife have a child.
Yeah.
Not because he was infertile. He just, as a couple, they couldn't make it happen. It was super important to them.
That's a heavy burden.
Yeah. And, God love them. They were married for 17 years before they got me. So, I mean, that's a long time to want a child and not have a
Yes.
child. Just tragic, I think.
So, Brad, how soon after your father admitting, yes, you were adopted, did you start thinking about, like, okay, well, where did I come from? Who are my people? Who are my biological parents?
So that's one of the spots where it's both good and bad. I did not have the discovery journey so many adoptees and DNA surprise people have because the person that found me was my biomom's sister. So much of the mystery that everybody else is trying to solve was handed to me immediately, which is great because you don't have to search for it, but it's also like drinking out of a fire hose. Sometimes it's a whole lot to take in all at once. The night that I found out, I mean, probably the most guy thing to do and the worst way to do it, but I knew I was doing everything I could because I was at work and I'm like, I have to work another 5 hours and I've just found out I'm adopted and I've got to get it back together for 5 more hours. So I can't call my wife on the phone because I'm going to break down and start crying and it is not going to stop for 5 hours and that can't happen. So I sent my wife a text and I was like, hey, funny story. That woman that's been messaging us is right. I just found out I'm adopted. I cannot talk to you on the phone right now because I've got to get my head together. But please let her know. And anything you want to find out, I would love because you're my safe place. You can be my conduit of information. This other person, even though technically now she's my aunt, I don't know her. You, I know, and you are a safe place for me to get information from. So you find out everything you can. And you can kind of dole it out to me as I'm ready to hear little bits and pieces more. So that was how we started the journey. I allowed the doling out to happen for maybe an hour because once I started finding out, I was like, well, I can't not know this. And finally I was like, hey, just let me see your phone with all the messages on it. And even she was like, I don't think you're ready for this yet. And I'm like, I know, but I can't not know anymore. So just let me just read them all. And she was right. I was so unprepared for where we were headed. But so, I mean, the day after I was told I was adopted, I knew everything about my biological family except a 100% certainty of who my biological father was. But my aunt was very certain about who she believed my biological father was.
Yeah.
And still had contact information for him. So there was not a lot of mystery.
Mine happened, listeners will know, but mine happened so similarly too. I mean, the day I found my brother, he told me this is my father's son. He told me the name of my birth mother in our first 30 seconds of speaking on the phone. And of course that didn't mean anything to me. And she had such a common name that I was like, okay, great. This is going to take me forever to find, but it didn't. And because within 3 weeks, I had found both sides of the biological family. So it can happen quickly. And
Mm-hmm.
for listeners who want things to happen quickly, both Brad and I can say that it's tough. It's tough. It's a lot to take in, even if, in my instance, I wanted to learn, right? This wasn't quite the surprise that Brad, you had, but it's still, my adopted parents have been gone for 30 years. And I think I had just resigned myself to the fact that I was never going to find.
I actually just had coffee with somebody that I've known for a little while that I found out had just the NPE surprise of dad is not dad. And she's wanting to find biofamily. And we had a long talk over coffee. And I was like, absolutely do it. I can give you the resources to do it. Also be ready that even if it's great, this is a lot to go through.
7 years in, it's not what I thought it was going to be.
No.
It's good. Don't get me wrong, but I think I've always been sort of an optimist, and I've also never felt rejection. So I never expected to be treated the way that I've been treated. And probably because I hadn't experienced it before, it pisses me off. Like,
Yeah.
How dare you treat me like that? I'm a good person. That's my approach. And I can't change that feeling. I might never get that. It's my biological mother's family. I'll probably never get all that resolved. Still worth it.
I don't think at some point you don't have to resolve being mad about certain things. Because, when you come at somebody with the idea of, I literally need nothing from you. I'm not trying to get in on inheritance. I don't need anything. All I want to know is who I am and where I came from. How far off do you have to be to not give somebody that?
Yeah, I agree. And I admire my half-sister, my mother's daughter. She and I have talked a few times about the fact that our grandmother, so my biological maternal grandmother, she lived with my sister and my sister's husband before she died. And I, because of who I am, can't fathom that she didn't say, oh, Stephanie, by the way, you've got a brother out there. You know what I mean? Like that. I admire my sister for not harboring resentment toward her because I would, because my sister and I love each other so much and we're so happy to have found each other. And I think to myself, we could have found each other sooner, but maybe we couldn't have without the DNA help. But maybe we would have tried the DNA thing earlier or as early as possible.
Well, and I do think that weighs heavily on people. I went from such a small family to such an enormous family. I still don't think I've met everybody yet, but I've met almost all the people physically close to me. So almost all the aunts and uncles, bio mom had already passed, but I met all these people. The very last person that was willing to meet me was my bio mom's husband, who had been married to her for 30 years before she passed.
Wow.
And his holdup was he was brokenhearted that she kept a 30-year secret from him. They shared everything, and he never knew that she gave up a baby for adoption before they met. Mm-hmm. And he really struggled with the fact that she was willing to keep that from him. And she's already passed. There's no reconciliation for him with that.
Right. At least my mother's husband knows about me. I guess that's one thing. But yeah, it's just, we talk a lot about secrecy and lies. And now I feel like the third theme is the shame. And
absolutely.
Yeah. It's sad, that my biological mother's 70 years old and she's been carrying this, for 54 years. It's just sad. But
it breaks my heart. My sister, who I probably got the closest to of everybody, she passed this year, or no, last year, because it's 2025 now. As she and I were getting to know each other, one of the first things she said was, everything makes so much more sense now. She was diagnosed as a teenager with something called polycythemia vera, which is a weird, rare blood disease, which basically means you can't have kids. What it turns out was she was misdiagnosed. She actually had ovarian cancer that if they caught much earlier, she would have survived, but they didn't. For her whole life, our mom told her, the reason you can't have kids is a curse brought on by me that I can't tell you about. I mean, she carried that for her whole life, that she made her daughter infertile. Completely illogical. It's absolutely not what happened.
We have not talked about your bio dad yet. And
Okay.
we know
Yeah.
there's a story there, but
there's a whole nother story there.
did you find out in that series of texts who he was?
Yes. So in that series of texts was the information that my bio dad was, or who my aunt believed my bio dad was a man that had been in prison since 1972. And so the cop side of me, I mean, that was probably even the worst thing that could happen, because the cop side of me was like, well, now I have to find out more about that. So I had his name. I don't think I had a birth date then, but I had his name. I knew he had committed murder. So I knew his crime. I knew his name, and I knew where it had happened. So I immediately dove to newspapers.com and went in all the archives and what can I find about this guy? And so, yeah, it turned out that I was a 49-year-old that had been a police officer for 25 years at that point, who had a biological father who'd been in prison for murder since 1972 that I knew nothing about. Or who my aunt seriously believed was my biological father. And part, since we love the family twist theme, part of the part that my aunt does not like to talk about is outside of her reasons for wanting to find me, of being the only person in the family that knew that I ever existed, because they were living in Dallas and the rest of the family was in Stockton when I was born, was her sisters did not believe her assertion that her little sister had had an affair with her husband back when she was married. And my biological father is also my aunt's first husband.
Oh boy.
So that was who she believed my father was. And she turned out to be right. But there was that extra little element in there as well.
Which, again, it's, you had no control over any of that situation, but that shame is sort of brought to you.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, let us kids just be who we are.
Yeah, I mean, we have nothing to do with this. I had no control over who you decided to sleep with, who you decided to marry. That wasn't me. I'm just the product of a lot of those decisions.
Yep. But
I think the crappy part is we are painful reminders for that time. Like to this day, my biological mom died in 2000. I found out in 2019. And do I wish I could have met her? Absolutely. She seems like an amazing woman. Do I think she ever would have wanted to meet me, knowing that she never told her husband she had a kid? I don't know.
I know.
I can't imagine what that would be like on the flip side, to be living your life one day. You gave up a baby 50 years ago, and all of a sudden that baby's like, hey, do you want to get to know each other now?
Yeah.
And your daughter doesn't know you had a baby before. She just knows you cursed her somehow with infertility, according to you, and your husband doesn't know. I don't know.
It's a lot. Yeah. And some people don't deal well with it,
No.
Yeah.
So being who you are, being a cop, and finding out that your bio dad is in prison for murder, does that make you really hesitant to want to have any contact with him, or does it make you more intrigued to have contact with him?
A little bit of both. It initially made me want to have as limited of contact as I could with him as possible. And that's from we all have our own issues. I've been a cop for 25 years. If you tell me, hey, somebody's done 50 years in prison, I can build a pretty good image of what I think I'm going to meet. And that wasn't really a great picture in my head.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So really, I knew I wanted to know about him. Initially, I didn't know if I was ever going to speak to him. I just knew I wanted to know of him. Then when, and I learned at the same time that my biological mother is deceased, so I know that's going to be a door. People can tell me all about her. but the best I will ever know is other people's descriptions of her, which are all filtered by their own lens of life. So I initially decided that, you know, I'd been a cop, but I hadn't really dealt with a lot, or I'd put a lot of people in prison, but I didn't really like hang out with them while they were in prison. So I learned things like people in prison have email. Didn't know that. So I was like, well, email is a fairly safe form of communication where I can reach out and touch you. You can send me things back. With email, if something's hard, I can just close that and walk away and come back tomorrow. So that was my decision. Was I was like, well, I'll email this guy and we'll talk, and that's perfect.
So at this point, did you know whether your biological father knew that you even existed?
Nope.
Oh, you didn't know which way?
I didn't initially, and then one of the things that will always be a struggle for my aunt and I is I pretty quickly found out that because she wanted proof that her sister had slept with her husband / ex-husband, she had reached out to him and given him all of my info, like my full name, my date of birth, trying to get him to admit to conceiving me with her sister.
Okay.
He did not know of me. He did not know I existed. He did not know my bio mom. He knew my bio mom was pregnant. He did not know it was his. He didn't know he had another son out there. That was all news to him.
So how do you even start an email?
So I was doing my writing the other day and I just rewrote this. The first line of my email was, "This is probably going to be as weird for you to read as it is for me to write it. But I think you may be my father. And I'm just trying to explore that. I mean, I'm not trying to be crass, but he's in prison. I don't need anything from you. You've been in prison for 50 years. I'm just trying to figure out if you are. And if you are, I'm just kind of curious about you." And his first email response was very generic in general. And I don't blame him a bit now, knowing that my aunt had already reached out to him. And he said, "I knew your mom. Yes, your mom and I spent some time together. I did not know that I had another kid out there. You absolutely could be my son, but I have no way to know if you are or not." And just very honest about it. And so, I was like, okay. I guess it was my aunt had sent me some older pictures of him, both early on in prison, later through his years in prison. And I had a picture from me, and I can send this to you if y'all want to add it to the show notes. But I had a picture of me, I think at 46, 47. And I had a picture of him at about that same age. So I cropped those two pictures, put them side by side, sent that to him in the next email and said, "I don't know if this helps, but here's a picture of you and I at about the same age." And his next email back was, "Well, hello, son. It's nice to meet you." Well, I wasn't ready for that. I shut that email and I didn't talk to him for a month. My brain was not at all prepared for acknowledging that reality that I was poking around at. So he took to it immediately, and I immediately went into panic mode and was like, "Oh, no, we're not going there yet."
Yeah.
But I mean, I think about somebody in his position, like that probably was amazing for him to get to meet you, even electronically.
For a couple reasons, I think it was because I do have a half brother from his side, and they had been out of contact for quite a while. They'd had a pretty big falling out. So he really didn't he had his sister who was out here, who was mentally declining health-wise. She has dementia. And his ex-wife that was my half-brother's mom had been remarried. He hadn't really kept in touch with my bio mom. So he didn't really have a lot of people out here other than just, some old friends. So I do think to have some kind of biological family contact was huge for him.
Because I can't stand to be in a small room. I can't imagine being imprisoned. So, you know what I mean? Like, that's just, to me, that was a lifeline for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So who made the next contact after that?
After about a month, I reached back out. And I think he had sent me a couple emails in the meantime. It's the way the prison email works. It's a completely separate email system. So I had to go into this other app to look at it. So when I finally went back, I had a couple others from him, and I apologized, was just upfront and said, that was just a lot for me to take in. So we started emailing back and forth. And then what really kicked things off for me was Lester Holt did a Dateline special on Angola State Penitentiary, which is where my father was in prison. And I had come to a conclusion that I was really pretty happy with him as a concept. Like, I know he's biologically my father. I've emailed with him. I've gotten to know some things about him. I've never seen him. I've never heard his voice. That was really a pretty comfortable place for me. That was a really safe box to put him in and keep him there. I had pretty much decided we weren't going to talk on the phone. I wasn't going to see him. This was a solid way to get to know this man that I wasn't sure I wanted to know that much anyway, and keep him like I couldn't imagine building a relationship with him just out of fear of losing somebody else at this point. My mom and dad were still very much my mom and dad, but with those surprises, everything is so different all of a sudden. There was so much loss in that. The idea of, okay, so if I get to know this guy and I hate him, I lose him. If he doesn't like me, I lose him. If he just stops talking to me, there's nothing I can do. So it was really scary to try to get to know him. And then I don't know if you have content warnings on your thing. So once again, edit me if you want to. And he actually, you don't have to edit this out because I've emailed him and he knows this. But I always for quite a while, I called him fucking Lester Holt because Lester Holt did this special on Dateline and my buddy tells me about it and I watch it. And that's the last time I sleep for 3 days. And I'm like, oh, the wheels came off the bus. I had the wheels really solidly on the bus, and this has really screwed things up because something about seeing, like I knew, prison movies, you were talking about being claustrophobic. Just about every movie prison you see, it is a 2-man cell with bars on this run. He had told me he was living in a 90-man dormitory. It basically looks like an army barracks. But there were 90 guys that slept in this barracks. So as I'm watching Lester Holt's special, I'm seeing a 90-man barrack, and I'm starting to wonder, is my father in there? And I'm seeing him and don't know it's him. He lived for 3 days in Angola, talked to people, wandered around. They filmed everywhere. So I'm watching this whole thing wondering, did I see my father? Did I not see my father? And suddenly this really safe concept box I had him nailed down in, he was creeping out of all the seams of the box. So no sleep for 3 days. I called our employee assistance hotline, talked to a therapist, and was like, I need to talk to somebody because I have some things going on. So off to therapy I went, and it was probably 6 weeks, maybe 3 months in that, I went and I told my therapist, what I'm really trying to figure out is, do I want to meet my biofather? We can hash through the secrets and the pain of all that later. The decision I'm trying to make is, do I want to meet this man? And about 6 weeks, just maybe a little bit longer in, we were talking one day and she said, okay, so I think the best way for you to look at this question is, you've told me he's had a heart attack in his 60s that he survived. He's 77, I think, at this point. Regardless, he's 75. He's getting up there in age. He's already had a heart attack. He's lived in prison for 50 years, which is not, the grandstand of healthy environments to keep going into old age in.
Yeah.
If you found out he died tomorrow, are you okay that you never met him? P.S. Remember, you're never going to meet your mom. And I'm like, oh, no, I'm not okay. She's like, well, then you have your answer. So I go from, I'm never going to meet this guy, I'm never going to talk to him on the phone, to now I've got to call him on the phone to try to schedule to meet with him. And so that I emailed him and said, listen, I think we need to talk on the phone. So he had suggested the phone so many times before that. And I'm sure I had not artfully dodged. I mean, I dodged them all. It was not artful. It was always like, I don't think we want to do that yet. So when I told him I wanted to talk on the phone, he was all for it because he'd been trying to do that the whole time. So we talk on the phone, and I tell him, I do think I want to come see you and meet you. And he said, that's great. So, what do I need to do to get on your visitor list? And he's like, well, it's really easy. I just need your full name, your date of birth, social security number, your driver's license number, your address. And I'm sitting there doing this list in my head of things I'm not giving to anybody, especially not somebody I don't really know in prison. So I guess visitation's out. And at the same time, I'm wondering, is this a scam? Does he really need all of this? I can't imagine this is what you need to go to visit somebody in prison. So I call the prison and I said, hey, I want to get on this guy's visitors list. What do I have to do? And they're like, well, you fill out this form, put you on the list. I'm like, okay, send me the form. Well, it was almost as lengthy of a background packet as I had to fill out to get hired as a police officer. Wow. So it turned out it was one of the first clues that literally everything he told me he needed was on these forms. So I was like, okay, so he wasn't full of it. This was all stuff he needed, and he was really just trying to help. And I mean, he even mentioned it in our first meeting. He's like, I know you were kind of standoffish with me. And I bristled thinking I was not standoffish, but I absolutely was standoffish because this guy in prison's asking me for all this personal info that I'm like, no. So I fill out my packet. And to this day, I have never been more excited to receive an acceptance letter than I was to get my acceptance letter to Angola State Penitentiary, which I don't understand why that should have ever been exciting. I'm still very, very compartmentalized. We're just talking. I'm still calling him Jim at this point. I don't mind him calling me son. I probably mind it more than I'm willing to admit. I just go with it. But, I had a dad. I had a good dad. And I'm like, I'm not calling him dad because I've already got a dad. He's still alive. I'm not sharing that title with somebody. So we get it all set up and I make the trip to Angola. And he's telling me when I'm 2 days before I make the trip, he's like, listen, I know the warden. And I mean, Angola has 6,000 plus inmates. And I'm like, I've built the image of who I'm going to meet in prison. And number one is he's full of crap. So telling me you know the warden and you're going to get me this extra long visit, I'm like, sure you are. I'm going to be there for an hour like everybody else. But great, tell me your story. At the end of the day, my plan, he didn't know this. He does now. We've talked about it since then. But my plan was I'm going to meet him. I'm going to find out whatever I can. And then we're done. We might email back and forth some just to keep in touch. But I have checked my box of I met my only living bio parent. And we're going to be done with this. So that was my full intention when I went to meet him. And then he screwed that all up. So totally his fault. So go ahead.
I was just saying, not the guy that you thought he was going to be.
No. So far the opposite of what I expected to meet. So, I expected somebody that was full of it. I already said that. No responsibility. I mean, most of my life has been around people that everything happened because somebody else did something that made something bad happen to them. It was never, I made a bad choice and here I sit in my own bad choices. It was the world was against me. And had the world not been against me, my life would have been fine. It's not because I made a lot of bad choices about my life.
Right.
And, I can't speak from the always known adopted side. And Kendall, you can chime in here and tell me. But, I feel like from the DNA surprise side, I'm already reeling from everybody short of my wife that's an adult in my life has been lying to me at some level. They've all been covering something up. So trust-wise, I'm not trusting at all rolling into this. I'm like, well, it's just one other adult that's full of crap in my life because everybody else has been so far. So I get to the prison, go inside, get checked in, get put on. I studied Angola Penitentiary when I was in college because it was close to where I went to school. So I knew of it, knew that it was a massive, it's like, I could be completely wrong. I want to say it's like 16,000 acres. It's this huge place. But so I get there and they put me on an airplane bus, like those little shuttle buses in an airport, and drive me more than a mile inside this prison. And I'm looking around going, it's like field after field. Like you don't even look like you're in prison at some points. And I'm going, well, this sucks because I don't know where I am. they're going to drop me off somewhere that if something bad happens, I don't know how you leave this place. Because, I mean, there's, it's prison. There's interconnecting roads everywhere. The prison camp that they dropped me off to meet him at was a mile and a half away from the gate to get into the prison. I couldn't even see the main gate to the prison where I'm at. And I'm like, this is awful.
That's weird.
Now, the upside was I'd been a cop, so I had been to prison. I had dealt with people in there. So there was the upside to that nothing was that new. When I started my law enforcement career, I worked for 2.5, 3 years in the Dallas County Jail, which was a really big, large county jail. So the actual place itself wasn't a new experience. Doors buzz, gates crash, close behind you. None of that was like, oh my God, that was something I'd done when I was in my 20s. So those weren't new experiences, but still just being there on the other side of it was very weird. So I get led into the visitation room finally, and I'm sitting there waiting, and there's other people in the visiting room. It wasn't like a little window visitation. It was a big day room filled with tables. So other people are waiting for visits. I'm watching people file in and out. All of a sudden, this guy comes in, and I'm like, oh God, that's me when I'm in my 70s. That's my bio dad. Crap. Oh, now what do you do? I hadn't really thought far enough ahead to what happens when he shows up here. So he walked in, we did the whole half hug, half dude back slappy thing. And we sit down at this table and, I am mute. I don't know what to say. And he starts. He said, well, son, I want to be honest with you, which was the worst thing in the world to say, because anybody who's ever told me they want to be honest with me is just starting a really long lie. So I go, well, and here we go. Exactly what I expected. I actually almost felt more comfortable because I'm like, well, here's his BS story. We're going to hear it now. You're getting what you expected. That's okay. This was a one and done thing anyway. No big deal. And he goes, I could tell you that I killed somebody because I was an alcoholic and a drug addict at the time, because I was doing drugs and I was an alcoholic back then. But that wouldn't be the truth. I killed somebody because somebody paid me to do it, and I regret it, and I can't fix it. And I just sat there because I was like, oh no, I think he just told the truth. And then it got worse because he starts telling me all this other stuff he's done. Pre-prison and being in prison, about how he's lived in prison, what he was doing before he murdered somebody and ended up in prison. And the more he's talking, the more part of me is being enamored, because I'm like, oh my gosh, this is an honest adult that's laying it all out here. And the other part of me is going, you should shut up, because I would never know any of this.
Right.
You're in prison for a thing, actually two things. He escaped once. So he's in prison for murder and escape. I knew those things. He had covered those two. And I'm like, the rest of this stuff, if you never told me, I would not have any way to find out. And he just keeps going. And I'm like, oh my God, just shh. But at the same time, the more he talks, the more I'm going, wow, he really wants to own up to who he is. And never in any of it was an excuse for anything. It was just, this was the person I was. He'll say to this day, I was a horrible person. And I can't go back and fix that part of me. Here I am today, but if you want to know why I'm here because I was a bad person for a long time. My whole plan was to get lied to, brush that off, and roll back out the door.
Yeah.
So was he right about being able to stay longer than an hour?
I was there for 8 hours.
Oh.
He lied about nothing. He knew the warden. He pointed the warden out when the warden walked through. They actually knew. And I'm like, oh, everything he said was the truth. And that's really hard to wrap your head around, because it was for me, because I'm like, no. He was supposed to lie about everything. And here he is just being an open book. And that was not how that was supposed to go. That was one of the biggest downsides to meeting the way we did. Was I got 8 hours with my biological father with no way to write anything down, write a note, record anything. It was being fed through a fire hose with no way to try to retain anything. And I'm just sitting there going, I'm not going to remember half of this, and I want to know all of it.
It's just interesting for me, because I think that in some ways, being there and knowing you needed to take full advantage of having him there was probably profound. I mean, Conversely, when I met my biological father, I felt like he's not an inquisitive man. Let me say that nicely. And I'm the opposite. And, so he didn't ask me questions. I'm not saying he wasn't interested in learning, but he's still to this day, he's not inquisitive at all. He lives in the moment, and that's pretty much it. So in some ways, I think I would have appreciated having 8 concentrated hours where I felt like I could, yeah, but you're right. Drinking from a fire hose for sure.
But I mean, you're right. There is an advantage to this dude can't go anywhere. We're not in a coffee shop where he can be like, and Kendall, you have offended me and I'm done with this. No, you're stuck. We're in prison. We're together.
Yep.
You have to sit at this table and deal with me because you've
Yep.
let me come. So I mean, there is a huge advantage to the trapped part.
When did you start thinking like this is not going to be a one and done, obviously?
I don't think the realization hit me until I got on the bus to leave his camp. And it was on, I mean, it's probably a 20 minute bus ride from where we had our visitation to back out of the prison. And that's when I really felt like the first time I could digest anything that just happened. And I had brought my wife with me to Baton Rouge, which is about 45 minutes from the prison. I promised myself I was not taking my wife to prison. That didn't seem like a cool thing to do. So I had left her at a hotel and I had gone here and I'm like, when I get done, I'll call you. I'm expecting an hour. It's now 4:00 in the afternoon. I've literally been there all day. And I called her. And so I couldn't have my phone till like my phone was locked in my car outside the prison. So
yeah.
As soon as I get all the way out, get in the car, I call her and I'm like, and she's like, well, how did it go? And I was like, well, I like him and I don't know what to do with that because that was not my goal. I mean, it was one thing to think, okay, well, I'll get to know this guy and maybe he's an okay guy. But I literally left liking him. And I'm like, oh crap, what do I do with this? Because I've still got a live mother, a live father. They were not down for this reunion process at all. So I'm out on my own doing this stuff. They're aging too. So I'm helping them. There's so much going on. And I'm like, this was not how I wanted this to go. It sounds awful, but it would have been in some levels easier had it been that one and done. Because it's like, okay, and we're done with this one. Mm-hmm. But to walk out and say, no, after my little 20-minute thought process, I like this guy and I want to talk to him more. Oh, no.
So what happens next?
Well, so what happened next was I met him, I think, on February 18th of 2020. And we were emailing back and forth. March 13th of 2020, my adoptive dad dies pretty unexpectedly. He'd been in the hospital for a week, had been home for a week, and was gone. I honestly think from COVID. Back then, we didn't really, it was the week before they actually started saying COVID was COVID. So I don't know, but I think that's what it was. So he died. And I think one of my big regrets that I had told myself I was going to do and didn't do in time was pull all these emails from the prison server because I can't get to them anymore. But I think I sent him one saying, hey, listen, my adoptive dad just died. I'm going to go incommunicado for a while because I've got a lot to deal with. It had, along with my adoptive dad dying, the November before my adoptive dad died, because like I said, we were rock solid secret keepers, was when we figured out that my mom had Alzheimer's and he'd been covering that up for a couple of years. So now I had adoptive dad has passed away. Absolutely. Through therapy, things have gotten a little more complicated with my view of him, but then absolutely my hero. So, I mean, I've lost him. I've inherited this person that I have struggled with my whole life who is not capable of managing for herself and does not know that because my dad has covered that up even from her. So for close to a month, maybe a little bit longer, I had told him we weren't going to talk and we didn't because I was doing my best to tread water every day.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got back in touch with each other. And the more we talked, and this, I'm going to shorten this as best I can. and you're welcome to ask questions because I know more about it than I'm going to talk about just because I don't want to drag your podcast out forever into this. But when my father pled guilty to murder, he was sentenced to what's called a 10-6 life sentence, which means in Louisiana in 1972, if you were given a life sentence, you were eligible for a flat release or parole in 10 years and 6 months. That's what life meant. Didn't mean you had to, but you were eligible for that. If you go back to your history classes, you'll remember that 1972 is also when the Supreme Court did the moratorium on the death penalty. And Louisiana had this panic of, we have these death row prisoners that may be all eligible for release if we don't have a death penalty anymore. So they met as the legislator and said, if we've given you life in prison, you now have to serve 20 years before you're eligible for parole. Well, my father was a year into what he thought was a 10-year 6 sentence, and now he's doing 20 years before he's eligible for parole. Fast forward to their next legislative session, and they're realizing that, oh, wait, most of these guys that are death rowers have already done 20 years. So this isn't working. So they up it and say, if we've given you life in prison, you now have to do 40 years. And what they're doing is they're retroactively applying this sentence to anybody currently serving time. So now he's looking, I think this would have been 4 years into his, what he thought was a 10-year sentence. He's now at a 40-year sentence, guaranteed before he looks at release. Well, Louisiana being Louisiana, they have another legislative session the following 2 years. And they say, we've rethought all this, and we're Louisiana, and if we gave you life in prison, we mean you die here. So anybody that's prison sentence says life is now life without parole. And this would have been, I think, about 6.5 years into what he thought was a 10-year sentence. So he went from, I pled guilty, I have the eligibility to get out, to 6 years later, I am not eligible for parole ever. And there's not an appeal process for that. These are legislative changes. So when I met him, he's doing life without parole. I am never going to say how long somebody should do in prison for murder. If you killed my parents or my wife, I want you to die in prison for murder. I get it. I'm not saying that should be any other way. My flip side of that is I'm kind of a strong constitutionalist. And I feel like if the state makes an agreement with you, they can't just retroactively change that on a whim. It would be like if I bought a car and every few years a dealership called and said, hey, Brad, that car is now worth $4,000 more than we told you it was. So I took issue with that side of it, not the fact that he could spend the rest of his life in prison, because he did take somebody else's life. And as all of this was happening and COVID was going on, it was awful because I could not go to see him. All I could do is talk to him on the phone, and it is literally every movie you've seen. You're receiving a call from Angola State Penitentiary from Jim. Do you want to accept this call? So, I mean, we had 10-minute calls like that. Those were all monitored. So it also very much limits what you're going to say. Face-to-face at a visitation table, we could talk about anything. On the phone, everything is recorded. Is it checked? Who knows? I know it was sometimes because we had a visit cut short that still baffles me to this day. But so what COVID did was Louisiana allowed for video visitation. So I was now allowed, I think it was 15-minute video chats with him. So I could actually see him face to face, still monitored, still very limited on what we're going to talk about. But I can at least see him, which, it's like we're doing right now. You just feel a little bit closer when you're seeing somebody you're talking to rather than just talking to a voice.
Absolutely.
But are they monitored? Absolutely. Because one time we're in the middle of a visit and the screen goes black. He emailed me the next day and said, apparently your visit was cut short because you violated rule such and such. I pull up the inmate visitation book. I had just come back from the gym. I was wearing a tank top. Tank tops are not allowed visitation attire. Somebody had popped on the video, seen me in a tank top, and just gone click and turned us off.
Wow.
So they did watch.
Wow.
Each other on kind of a different level. My dad died in March of 2020. For Christmas of 2020, I got to spend 15 minutes with my bio dad, hiding upstairs in my bedroom. We didn't want her to know. Having video Christmas with my father who's in prison. And as we're getting to know each other, I'm getting more and more into this mindset. He even admits, absolutely in there for a reason. He should be in there. No, there's no debate. He said, I killed somebody and I'm sitting in prison because I did that. But the New Orleans DA at that time had started a program or was pushing for a bill that would allow these guys that had gone in for life sentences to be eligible for release like they were when they were initially sentenced. And what was strange was they had done this in kind of waves. They had recognized the 40 to life without parole and the 20 to life without parole and rectified both of those decisions. But they had forgotten there were still 40 guys, and that was all that was left because you have to figure all these guys were sentenced 72 and prior. So they were all, none of them were young. There were only 40 of them left that weren't 20 to life or 40 to life. They were 10-6 to life. And those legislative changes they had done, like in 2017, didn't affect those 40 guys that had started at 10-6. So he had recognized this and had started this bill that got passed that if the court that sentenced you and the district attorney's office that prosecuted you could come up with a new sentence, that was your new sentence. So what he was doing in Orleans Parish was he would come and he would say, Kendall, how long have you been in prison? And you'd say, 49 years, 7 days. And he would say, well, your new sentence is 49 years and 8 days. We're releasing you tomorrow. So they were just cutting people loose, one after the other. The problem was my father had been sentenced out of Caddo Parish. This law that they had written was an option for every DA's office. It was not at all a requirement. So you had to ask for this to happen. I feel better saying this because I can't feel like there's any way I'll get in trouble for it. I 100% cheated. I sent every email to Caddo Parish from my police email because I knew even if they were going to tell me to pound sand, they would at least answer me because I was a police officer. So I started emailing back and forth with Caddo Parish. I spent a year emailing back and forth with one of their super nice lady, assistant district attorney. She asked me to put together a file, an actual hard copy file for her of all of his prison accomplishments, his discipline record, his everything that had his prison stuff in it. Send her the physical file. They wouldn't take digital copies. So we did all that. And over a year, we'd correspond off and on because this was not, she was the head of their appeals process. So she was dealing with much more than just, oh, will you review my father's case? But after a year, she reached out and said, listen, I've talked to the DA, and where the DA stands is we're not doing this. He's not interested in opening a can of worms like this because once you do one, you've got to do more, and he's not going to do it. He can't be made to do it, so we're kind of at a dead end. Right. But then she said, but there is legislation that we think is coming next year that may still help your father's case. So look up this House bill and just kind of keep an eye on it. Supposedly this other legislation's coming. Here's the thing. So it turned out she was right. And that following year, they introduced a bill through a group called the Parole Project in Louisiana, who I had reached out to when all of this started and had told me, listen, your father is life without parole, which means there's nothing we can do for him. Well, they had made this push for all 10-6 lifers. They wanted a bill that said anybody that was sentenced to a 10-6 life sentence is immediately eligible for parole. We're not saying you should all be released because you may be a horrible inmate. You may be in there killing your cellie every chance you get, but you should at least have the ability to be considered. So I reached back out to the Parole Project because it turned out that the man that runs the Parole Project had been in prison with my father and knew him. So once again, I didn't use my police email to cheat, but I Facebook stalked him. I found his personal Facebook page and I started sending him personal messages I stopped contacting the Parole Project. I just started contacting him being like, hey, you know my father. This is who I am. I want to talk to you, blah, blah, blah. And finally he responded back and he said, listen, I do know your dad and yeah, let's talk. I don't know where this law is going. But while all this is going on in the background, my sister has been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, gone through all of the treatments, had some success. It slowed down. It would remetastasize. It would slow down. So that's going on in the background while we're dealing with pop stuff. And it's now March of 2022. My sister's basically been told, listen, we've got one more thing we're doing, but ultimately you're going to die of ovarian cancer. We cannot save you. So, we just want you to be able to have time to come to peace with what you want to do. Well, one of her dreams was to get married in Las Vegas to her then common law husband. And they couldn't figure out how to get to Vegas. So Pam and I figured out a way to get them to Vegas. They wanted, you can decide what you want to think of my family. My sister desperately wanted to get married on 420 in Vegas. So we'll just let that say what it says.
Yeah.
And so we got that arranged. She said, well, if y'all are doing this for us, do you want to come be our witnesses? And I'm like, yeah, that'd be amazing. That, because she and I'm watching my sister die, and that's a whole nother long, crappy story. But we had gotten super close by then. Now I'm going to get to be at her wedding. That seems like a really cool brother thing to get to do for my little sister, even though I know it's not going to be a long-term thing. So we get that all set up. The Wednesday of her wedding, I'm getting dressed that morning, and my phone rings, and it's Andrew from the Parole Project. He said, well, it looks like this bill may actually happen. Because I told him, anything I can do to help, let me know, because I would really like to see Pop get this opportunity. Well, he said, it looks like this is happening. Any chance you could be in Louisiana on Monday? And he said, well, you're one of the few people that is a living relative of a 10-6 lifer. And the fact that you're a police officer, we want to use to our advantage. And we want you to come testify at the House Criminal Justice Committee about why they should pass this bill. And I'm still sorting through. I'm at my sister's wedding in Vegas, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I guess I'll be in Louisiana on Monday. So we get her wedding. We have all of our wedding fun. Fly back Saturday. Sunday, I am in the car driving to Baton Rouge from Texas. And Monday morning, I'm sitting in the Louisiana legislature testifying about a bill about why they should consider releasing people like my father. And that goes well. The committee votes in favor of it. It goes that following week to, I think, the full house. The full house votes in favor of it. And I'm in contact with Andrew back and forth. And I said, what's next? He said, well, the same thing happens with the Senate. And I said, okay, do you need me to come testify at the Senate? And he goes, I don't know. Let's just see how it flows from here. Well, then I think it was June-ish. He called me again and said, yeah, I want you to come back and testify for the Senate because we really want to try to push this thing through. They've made some changes that we don't like, basically, but that's a strange place. The change they made to the bill was if you had a 10-6 life sentence and you took your United States constitutional right to a trial, you were not eligible for parole. You were only going to be eligible if you'd pled guilty, because otherwise you'd been a pain to the state. So they were still hoping to get the full bill passed and make anybody that had gotten the 10-6 eligible. So they said, would you come back and testify again? I was like, sure. So back, did the same thing for their Senate Criminal Justice Committee, testified, answered the questions they had for me about the whys and why I thought as a police officer it should happen. I had to go to my police administration saying, listen, I want to speak as a police officer, but I will absolutely not speak on behalf of the police department, because you may not necessarily agree with some of the things I'm about to say, but I still hold, whether you agree with them or not, I'm still a police officer. So I do that. And then the week later, watch it pass the Senate on YouTube. I never thought I would be watching YouTube votes for the Louisiana legislature, but I was fascinated by that when I sat there and watched. So it passed. I called Pop the minute I saw it pass, or sent him an email to call me, called him, and he called and I said, listen, it's done. You, as soon as the governor signs this, are parole eligible after 40-ish years of not being. And, he said, great. So then my next call was to Andrew from the Parole Project. And I said, listen, here's where I become the bad guy and ask for my piece of the pie. All I want is I want Pop to be first. But, at this point, he would have been 77. He's still the same dude that had the massive Widowmaker heart attack and died in prison and they revived. And I'm like, I don't, I had already lost a parent at this point. So I'm like, it's becoming very clear to me that there's an age where I'm losing my parents. And it was awful to me to think that he could have this in sight and die sitting in there watching. So Andrew said, absolutely. We'll see if we can make that happen. That seems fair. So he ended up being the second parole hearing for 10 Sixers. The only reason he was the second was, and I think this is most prisons, so this won't be me bashing Louisiana, but when you're coming up for parole hearing, you have to have a clean discipline record. If you get any disciplinary infraction coming up to your parole hearing, you're just taken off the calendar. Well, they had a guy that was up for parole, not a 10 Sixer, get a disciplinary infraction in a separate prison from where my father was. And they stuck a 10 Sixer in his slot because they needed somebody to go to that spot. So Pop ended up being the second parole hearing. And that would have been November, 16th. I'm back in Angola State Penitentiary sitting in this room. And it was hard on a lot of levels. A, it was terrifying. B, the family of the man whose life he took spoke out against his parole, which, no ill feelings. You put me in their shoes. Oh, I'm doing it. So can't be mad at him over it. So I'm listening to them talk about, and he's having to listen to it too, because everything was by video except for people speaking on behalf of my father for the hearing. Even the parole board was on video. Nobody was in that room except me, my father, one of my father's friends, the attorney representing him for the parole project, trying to work him through this, and some prison guards. So, we're all watching these people talk about the devastation that his choice created in their life for the rest of their lives. Some of them had been to prison for drunk driving, to become alcoholics. So I speak at the parole hearing. A couple of his friends speak at the parole hearing. And then we're down to the vote, which was, I couldn't have cast a movie better. There was this lady, the parole hearing is a 3-person panel, and it has to be a unanimous vote. All 3 have to say yes. As soon as one says no, you're done. And there's a lady that reminds me, I don't know what she did for her regular job, but she should be a kindergarten teacher because she is engaged in everything you say. She's nodding and she's smiling and she's happy that you're talking to her. The guy next to her just is kind of there. He doesn't seem like he's opposed to anything, but he's not certainly for anything. And the third guy looked like he wanted to be anywhere else than where he was. He just looked mad. And I'm like, well, damn, this is not going to be a unanimous 3-person vote. So, and they actually voted in that same order I listed him. So they get to her and she's like, absolutely. Here's all the great things he's done. I think he should have an opportunity. The second guy starts and he says, we really have to weigh, and he lays out, and it's all very legitimate, where does punishment for a crime turn into rehabilitation? Does rehabilitation matter to us, or are we truly just trying to punish you? And he lays it out, but he eventually votes in favor too, and we end up at the mad guy. And the mad guy just starts off with, people go to prison to be punished for what they do. Oh no, here we go. Mm-hmm. He talked the longest, but about halfway through his talk, he suddenly says, but we do have to look at rehabilitation. I'm like, oh, maybe there's a chance here. And I always get choked up when I talk about this part. I did it this weekend, and still, I don't know why anymore. But so he gets done and he votes yes. And they had told us before the hearing, because there's also a group of people of the family of a man he's killed watching this, thou shalt not display emotion in this hearing until we say so. So they all vote yes. And, we're all sitting there just waiting to do something. And they finally say, okay, the camera's off. And we all just burst into tears, start hugging. He's crying. His friend that I'm with is about this tiny little lady is about broken my forearm because she is just wrenching it in half while people are testifying. And all of a sudden, he's leaving prison. So we walk out of the parole room, we sit down, and they're like, it takes a day to process paperwork. We'll be releasing him tomorrow around noon. And, I'm A, ecstatic. B, when all of this started, my wife and I were very much on the same page. And we stayed on the same page and kind of grew as this whole thing changed. But when this first started, we were both on the page of, well, the one thing is, it's not like this dude's ever showing up at our doorstep. And we've gone from that to I'm sitting in a room trying to get him out of prison. So now he absolutely could show up at our doorstep because I've changed some things. One of those fun benefits of being a police officer was we get back out in the main waiting room. There were probably 12 guys going up for parole that day. And I think 2 out of the 12 got denied. But I hugged so many random dudes that just came out looking for somebody to share a little excitement with, that they weren't staying in this hellhole anymore.
Yeah.
It gave me a whole new perspective on what I've done for my job for all these years that I had never experienced. But so I'm talking to Andrew from the Parole Project, and he said, he actually doesn't report the parole plan because we're in Texas, he's in Louisiana. He has to be approved to come to Texas because he's being paroled in Louisiana. Texas has to accept him, and Louisiana has to be willing to send him. So parole plan step 1 is go to transition house. I mean, you have to really put on your way back cap. But he went to prison in 1972. Things have changed just a little bit now. And that he wasn't totally technologically backwards. Like they had, if you've ever seen a prison movie and you see the old TV that has the clear plastic back case so you can't hide contraband in it, he had a Nexus tablet that looked just like that. Clear plastic back, but that was where they watched movies. That's where he got his email. That's where he did all his communication from. So he had worked like a touchscreen things before, but still a wee bit different from 1972. So he had to go to a transition house. But Andrew said, the transition house actually doesn't kick off till Monday. He's being released on Thursday. You're a police officer. We're not worried about him getting in trouble. Do you want him till Monday? And I'm like, oh, yeah. So we spent our first 3 days. It was me, his friend that helped me work through his parole, and him in Baton Rouge, going out to eat, hanging out. I actually met some people he did time with. It was a whole nother experience. I mean, see people that had, A, meet people that have been in prison that I hadn't met before, but B, hear stories about what it was like in there, especially in the early 70s. I mean, A, prison reform hasn't reformed near as much as it should, but B, back then, I mean, he flat told me they were in a 90-man dorm. Night count was at 9. Morning count was at 6. So from 9 at night till 6 in the morning, the guards did their count, walked out of the dorm, locked the door with all of them in there, and they didn't come back till 6 in the morning. Anything you could get away with between 9 and 6 was fair game. Killing somebody? He told me stories of waking up with a dude laying in a pool of blood next to his bunk, dead. He slept through a stabbing. So just a hellhole of a place. We got him for 3 days and then a transition house, I think, for a month when he was approved to go to Texas. I drove to Louisiana, picked him up, and drove him to Texas.
He lives near you now.
He's about 45 minutes away. He's actually, it's a fun and strange story. I mean, the serendipity that we all talk about in all these discoveries is weird enough, but early on when we were getting to know each other, he told me, he said, I'd like you to talk to my girlfriend. And I was already like, how do you have a girlfriend? You've been in prison forever. And he's like, well, my girlfriend is my ex-wife and we've kind of rekindled things. And I think you already know her. And my first thought was, of all of the things that have happened, I am 100% sure I don't know your damn girlfriend. There is no way. And he said, well, her name is Fanny, which is a weird name. And she works in HR at the city that you work at. And she was my HR rep. I'd known her for 18 years. And she had no idea who I was. So, yes, he was right. Once again, I knew his girlfriend.
Bizarre.
So, fast forward, he got out, spent a little time with his friend that had helped me get him out. And the more he and Fanny talked, they rekindled things. And he now lives with her.
Very cool.
And they're like two high school kids rekindling a relationship. It's very cute.
Well, he's making up for
50 years.
Yeah, exactly. So much lost time.
Have you shared your love of horror and art with him?
Yes. So that was one of the interesting discoveries from all of this is before he chose, we'll just call it a life of crime, he was a junior draftsman. He's drawn his whole life. He paints, he turns wood. It turned out that all these artistic urges that I grew up ignoring because I grew up in a house of very much a sports family all came very naturally. I have bowls he's turned in my house. I have a huge painting. He had never painted. He had drawn because he was a draftsman, but figured he could paint. He learned to paint watching Bob Ross VHS tapes in Angola State Penitentiary is how he learned to paint.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, yes, I'm settling into this new who I am, but it's all making more sense because, all of this stuff comes naturally to me because it's in my DNA.
Yeah. I love it. It's come full circle.
Yeah, we have shared the art stuff, and then he's very much an action movie person, but my half-brother and I have also taken him to see a handful of horror movies that he seems to really, he likes action. So cool. If it's scary action, he'll go. If it's action, he'll go.
That's cool. That's very, very cool. On the Horror Heals podcast, we always ask as the last question, who is your favorite final person in a horror movie?
Yep. Have y'all watched Strange Darling yet?
So that is not ringing a bell.
So
we will tonight.
My favorite final person is, I think she's titled in the credits Lady. She calls herself a couple times the Electric Lady. She is my favorite. Before then, I would have said what so many other people said on here, which is Jamie Lee Curtis and all the Halloween movies, because that's by far my favorite franchise. But I loved her character and how she played that character out through that movie.
Oh, definitely have to check it out. I love discovering something new.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for your time and for the beautiful artwork. We can't thank you enough for that. Brad's story is proof that healing doesn't come in a straight line. It's messy, complicated, and full of unexpected turns. What started as a reluctant meeting became an 8-hour conversation that altered his entire perspective. And through everything, from uncovering a hidden past to facing his own physical recovery, art and horror have been some of his anchors. Brad, we can't thank you enough for sharing your journey, your honesty, and your incredible artwork with us. And to our listeners, if you've ever found solace in horror, if it's helped you through tough times, or if you just have your own story to tell, we want to hear from you. Let's keep this conversation going because, as we know, horror doesn't just scare us, it saves us. And if you really enjoyed Brad's story, we implore you to check out our other podcast, Family Twist, linked in the show notes. There are some really incredible stories to be heard. And remember, when someone asks, is horror good for mental wellness? You tell them, of course it is. The Horror Heals podcast is produced and presented by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC.